What happens when a respected Hollywood veteran sits down for what should be a friendly chat, only to discover his host has prepared an ambush? In just 35 seconds of television, Stephen Colbert would say something so shocking, so completely out of line, that it would force Josh Brolin to make a decision that no guest should ever have to make on live television. Josh Brolin walked onto that stage, expecting the usual banter. You know the drill. A few jokes about his latest movie, maybe some playful ribbing about his past roles, the kind of light entertainment that makes these shows work. The audience was warm, welcoming even. They loved seeing Brolan, this larger-than-life presence who had given them everything from No Country for Old Men to the Marvel Universe. But Stephen Colbert had other plans. From the moment Brolan sat down, something felt different. Colbert's usual charm seemed forced, his smile a little too tight. The first few minutes went normally enough. They talked about Brolan's new film, the usual Hollywood stories that audiences eat up. Brolan was relaxed, funny, giving great answers that had the crowd laughing. Then Colbert shifted gears. "So Josh," Colbert said, leaning back in his chair with that familiar smirk, "I have to ask you about something that's been bothering me." Brolan raised an eyebrow, still smiling but clearly sensing the change in tone. "Shoot." "Well, you've played a lot of tough guys over the years. Villains, anti-heroes, you know the type. And I'm wondering," Colbert paused here, letting the moment hang in the air, "is that because you're compensating for something in real life?" The audience went quiet, not the good kind of quiet where everyone's hanging on every word. The uncomfortable kind where people aren't sure if they should laugh or not. Brolan's expression shifted slightly. The easygoing smile tightened just a fraction. "What do you mean by that, Stephen?" "Oh, come on," Colbert said, waving his hand dismissively. "We all know actors choose roles that speak to them somehow. Maybe all these bad guy parts are your way of working through some personal issues?" Now, this is where a more seasoned talk show host would have pulled back, would have recognized that the joke wasn't landing and smoothly moved on to safer ground. But Colbert doubled down. "I mean, your father wasn't exactly Father of the Year, was he? James Brolan had his issues. Maybe you're trying to work through some daddy problems on screen?" The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. Brolan's jaw tightened, and you could see him processing what had just been said to him on national television. This wasn't playful banter anymore. This was personal. "That's a pretty heavy accusation to throw around on a talk show, don't you think?" Brolan said, his voice calm but with an edge that anyone paying attention would have noticed. But Colbert wasn't done. In fact, he seemed energized by Brolan's discomfort, like a shark that had smelled blood in the water. "Hey, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," Colbert replied with a shrug that somehow managed to be both casual and cruel. "You've got to admit, there's a pattern there. Troubled characters, violent roles, complex father figures. It doesn't take a psychology degree to connect those dots." This is where things started to go really wrong, because Josh Brolin, who had been nothing but professional up to this point, finally decided he'd had enough. "Stephen, I came here to talk about my work, not to be psychoanalyzed by someone who thinks he knows me based on the characters I play," Brolan said, sitting forward in his chair. "That's not fair, and it's not accurate." The audience was completely silent now. You could feel the tension through the television screen. This wasn't the fun, light-hearted interview they'd expected when they bought their tickets. But instead of backing down, instead of reading the room and changing course, Colbert pressed even harder. "Fair?" he said, letting out a laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Josh, you're sitting on my show, promoting your movie, making millions of dollars playing pretend. I think you can handle a few tough questions." "Tough questions about my work, sure," Brolan replied, his voice getting harder. "But when you start making assumptions about my family, about my relationship with my father, that crosses a line." Now here's the thing about Stephen Colbert that people don't always see. Behind that friendly facade, there's an ego the size of Manhattan. And when that ego gets challenged, when someone doesn't play along with his vision of how things should go, he can get nasty. Really nasty. "Oh, I crossed a line?" Colbert said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What are you going to do about it, Josh? Storm off? Walk out? That would really prove my point about you having anger issues, wouldn't it?" The camera caught everything. Brolan's hands clenching slightly on the armrest of his chair. The way his breathing changed. The exact moment when he realized that this wasn't going to get better, that Colbert was going to keep pushing until something broke. "Stephen, I think you should move on to another topic," Brolan said, his voice deadly calm now. It was the kind of calm that people who know Josh Brolin recognize as a warning sign. But Colbert, riding high on whatever power trip he was on, made the biggest mistake of the night. Or what? He said, leaning forward with that smug smile. What exactly are you going to do if I don't? Show me that famous Brolan temper we've all heard about? Come on, Josh. Give us a little taste of that method acting. Show us what Thanos would do. The audience actually gasped at that one. Even they could tell that Colbert had gone too far. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was cruelty. And that's when Josh Brolin did something that shocked everyone in that studio, including Stephen Colbert himself. Josh Brolin stood up, not dramatically, not with a big flourish or a chair flying backward. He simply, calmly stood up from his chair like a man who had made a decision. And in that moment, Stephen Colbert realized he had badly miscalculated. Josh, come on, Colbert said, suddenly trying to backtrack. It was just a joke. Sit down. We're having fun here. But Brolan wasn't having it. He looked down at Colbert, still seated behind his desk, and said something that cut through all the pretense and fake television politeness. Stephen, do you have children? The question caught Colbert off guard. Yes. I have 3 kids. What does that have to do with anything? How would you feel if someone went on television and started making jokes about how your relationship with them shaped who they are? How would you feel if someone took your private family life and turned it into entertainment for strangers? Colbert's face went pale, because suddenly he understood what he had done. But instead of apologizing, instead of taking the graceful exit that Brolan was offering him, his ego kicked in again. That's different, Colbert said, his voice getting defensive. My kids aren't public figures. You chose to be in the spotlight. I chose to be an actor, Brolan replied, his voice getting louder now. I didn't choose to have my family relationships dissected by someone who doesn't know me, doesn't know my father, and doesn't know what he's talking about. The audience was completely transfixed now. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. This was a masterclass in how to handle a bully, and they were watching it unfold in real time. Colbert, sensing he was losing control of his own show, tried to regain the upper hand with humor. Big mistake. Okay, I get it. You're sensitive about family stuff. That's actually kind of sweet, very touching. Maybe that's why you're so good at playing the sensitive, tough guy roles. If Colbert thought that would diffuse the situation, he was dead wrong. Because now Brolan wasn't just angry about the personal attacks. He was angry about being condescended to. Sensitive? Brolan repeated, and there was something in his voice now that made everyone in that studio sit up a little straighter. Stephen, let me tell you what sensitive means. Sensitive means I've spent the last 15 minutes trying to give you a way out of this mess you've created. Sensitive means I've been polite while you've been deliberately cruel. Sensitive means I'm still standing here instead of walking off your stage like any reasonable person would do. The camera operators didn't know where to look. Do you keep the cameras rolling when a guest is eviscerating your host? Do you cut to commercial? Nobody seemed to know what to do, so they just kept filming. Colbert, realizing that his usual tactics weren't working, tried a different approach. He tried to make Brolan the villain. Look, Josh, I understand you're upset, but this is how late-night television works. We poke fun. We push boundaries. We have a little fun with our guests. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. That was the moment. That was when Josh Brolin showed everyone watching exactly what kind of man he really was. Stephen, he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, I've done hundreds of interviews. I've been on every major talk show, every morning show, every entertainment program you can think of. I've been asked tough questions about my work, my choices, my career. I've been roasted, I've been challenged, I've been put through the ringer by some of the best interviewers in the business, and you know what? I loved every minute of it. Because that's what good hosts do. They challenge you professionally. They make you think. They bring out the best in their guests. He paused, letting that sink in before delivering the killing blow. What you're doing isn't challenging. It's not clever. It's not entertainment. It's just mean. And the fact that you think hiding behind jokes makes it okay shows exactly what kind of person you are. The studio was dead silent. Even the crew members had stopped what they were doing to listen. This wasn't just a celebrity having a meltdown. This was one human being calling out another human being for their behavior. And it was devastating in its honesty. Colbert tried one more time to regain control. Josh, come on, sit down. Let's start over. We'll talk about the movie. We'll keep it light. No, Brolan said simply. We won't. What do you mean no? I'm not going to sit here and pretend that what just happened didn't happen. I'm not going to smile and laugh and help you save face after you spent the last 20 minutes trying to humiliate me for your audience's entertainment. Colbert's mask was completely off now. The friendly late-night host was gone, replaced by someone who clearly wasn't used to being challenged on his own show. Fine, Colbert said, his voice sharp with anger. If you want to throw a tantrum on my show, that's your choice. But don't expect me to apologize for doing my job. Your job? Brolan repeated, and now there was genuine incredulity in his voice. Stephen, your job is supposed to be making good television. Your job is supposed to be entertaining your audience, not making your guests uncomfortable for cheap laughs. Your job is supposed to be bringing out interesting stories and insights from the people who come on your show. He gestured toward the audience, who were watching this unfold like spectators at a car crash. Look at them, Brolan said. Do they look entertained? Do they look like they're having fun? Because from where I'm standing, they look embarrassed. They look uncomfortable. They look like they came here expecting to have a good time, and instead they're watching their hero act like a schoolyard bully. That hit home. You could see it in Colbert's face, because deep down, he knew Brolan was right. The audience wasn't laughing. They weren't cheering. They were just sitting there, witnessing something that felt more like a public breakdown than entertainment. But instead of acknowledging that, instead of taking responsibility, Colbert doubled down one more time. You know what, Josh? Maybe you're right. Maybe this isn't working out. Maybe you should leave. The words hung in the air like a challenge, because everyone in that room knew what Colbert was doing. He was trying to make it look like Brolan was the problem, like Brolan was the one who couldn't handle a simple interview. Josh Brolin smiled then, not a happy smile, the kind of smile that appears on someone's face when they realize they've been underestimated by exactly the wrong person. You want me to leave? Brolan asked, that dangerous smile still playing at the corners of his mouth. Interesting. Because 5 minutes ago you were begging me to sit down and continue this interview. Now suddenly you want me gone. What changed, Stephen? Colbert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was trapped, and he knew it. If he said yes, he wanted Brolan gone, he looked like the bad guy who couldn't handle being challenged. If he said no, he had to continue dealing with a guest who had completely taken control of his own show. I just think maybe we're not a good fit tonight, Colbert said, trying to sound reasonable. Sometimes these things don't work out. No, Stephen, Brolan said, his voice cutting through the diplomatic language like a knife. Don't do that. Don't try to make this sound mutual. You attacked my family. You made personal comments about my relationship with my father. You tried to humiliate me on national television. And when I stood up for myself, when I refused to play along with your little power game, you told me to leave. Own it. The audience was completely captivated now. This wasn't just entertainment anymore. This was real, raw, honest, and they were seeing something they'd never seen before. A guest holding a host accountable for his behavior. Colbert looked around desperately, trying to find some way out of the corner he'd painted himself into. Josh, I think you're overreacting here. It's late-night television. Everyone knows it's all in good fun. Fun? Brolan repeated, and his voice was deadly quiet now. Stephen, let me ask you something. When you go home tonight, when you're lying in bed thinking about this interview, are you going to feel good about what happened here? Are you going to be proud of how you treated someone who came on your show as a guest? The question hung in the air, like an accusation. Because everyone in that room, including Colbert himself, knew the answer. When your kids watch this back, Brolan continued, are you going to be comfortable with them seeing their father act this way? Are you going to be able to explain to them why you thought it was okay to mock someone's family relationships for laughs? Colbert's face went red. Whether from embarrassment or anger, nobody could tell. Don't bring my children into this. Why not? Brolan shot back immediately. You brought my father into this. You made my family relationships part of your entertainment. Why are your kids off limits but mine aren't? The hypocrisy was so obvious, so blatant, that even Colbert couldn't argue with it. He just sat there, opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water. You know what the really sad part is? Brolan said, and now his voice had shifted again. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with something else. Disappointment. I used to respect you, Stephen. I used to think you were one of the good ones. Smart, funny, thoughtful. Someone who elevated the conversation instead of dragging it down into the gutter. He shook his head, looking genuinely saddened by what he was seeing. But tonight, you showed me who you really are when the cameras are rolling and you think you have all the power. You're just another bully who gets his kicks from making other people uncomfortable. Colbert finally found his voice again, but it came out as a weak protest. That's not fair. You don't know me. You're right, Brolan agreed. I don't know you, but your audience does. And after tonight, they're going to know you a little better too. He turned to face the crowd directly, something that guests almost never do during a talk show interview. Ladies and gentlemen, You came here tonight expecting to see a conversation between two adults about movies and acting and maybe some funny stories from Hollywood. Instead, you gotta watch your host try to psychoanalyze a guest based on the characters he plays in movies. You gotta watch him make cruel jokes about family relationships. And when that guest stood up for himself, you gotta watch your host tell him to leave. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. I want you to think about that when you go home tonight, Brolan continued. I want you to ask yourselves, is this really the kind of entertainment you want? Is this really the kind of person you want representing you on television? Because this is who Stephen Colbert really is when he thinks he can get away with it. Now Colbert was getting desperate. He could see his reputation crumbling in real time, and he made one last, catastrophic attempt to regain control. You know what, Josh? You're right. I don't want you on my show. Security, please escort Mr. Brolin off the premises. The words echoed through the studio like a gunshot, because everyone understood what had just happened. Stephen Colbert had just called security on Josh Brolin for the crime of defending himself. But Brolan didn't look worried. If anything, he looked relieved. Like Colbert had just given him exactly what he needed. Perfect, Brolan said, his voice calm and confident. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for making it absolutely crystal clear to everyone watching exactly what kind of person you are. He started walking toward the edge of the stage, but then he stopped and turned back one more time. You know, Stephen, I've met a lot of people in this business. Actors, directors, producers, executives. Some of them are good people, some of them aren't. But I've never met anyone who seemed so desperate to prove they were clever that they forgot to be decent. The security guards had arrived by now, but they looked uncomfortable. Nobody wanted to put their hands on Josh Brolin, especially not after what they'd just witnessed. It's okay, guys, Brolan said to them, his voice kind and understanding. I'll walk myself out. No need to make this any more embarrassing for your boss than it already is. And then he did something that nobody expected. He walked over to the front row of the audience and started shaking hands and saying goodbye to the people who had come to see the show. Thank you for coming tonight, he said to an elderly woman in the front row. I'm sorry you had to see this. Thank you for standing up for yourself, she replied, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen on television. More audience members started standing up, reaching out to shake Brolin's hand or pat him on the back. It was unprecedented. The guest was getting a standing ovation while the host sat behind his desk, looking smaller and more pathetic by the second. As Brolan made his way toward the exit, he stopped one more time and looked back at Colbert. Stephen, I hope someday you figure out the difference between being clever and being cruel. Your audience deserves better than this. You used to be better than this. And with that, Josh Brolin walked off the stage, leaving Stephen Colbert sitting alone behind his desk in front of a studio full of people who had just witnessed the complete destruction of everything they thought they knew about their favorite late-night host. The cameras kept rolling for another few seconds, capturing Colbert's face as he tried to process what had just happened. He looked lost, confused, like a man who had just discovered that the world didn't actually revolve around him. Finally, someone behind the cameras yelled, "Cut!" and the nightmare was over. But for Stephen Colbert, the real nightmare was just beginning. Because in 35 seconds of cruel comments and bad decisions, he had shown his true face to the world, and Josh Brolin had made sure that everyone saw it.